I'm Laurie Thomas with the University of Kentucky Forestry and Natural Resources Extension, and I'm here with Kentucky's native conifer trees. Kentucky has numerous native conifer trees in our forest and planted throughout our landscapes. But before we jump into the different conifers and their characteristics that help identify them, let's define what a conifer is. So conifers are a group of cone-bearing seed plants, and they're a subset of gymnosperms. And gymnosperms are a group of seed-producing plants that include conifers, cycads, ginkgo, and gonadophytes. Gymnosperm means naked seed or exposed seed, as their seeds are found in their cone-like structures. Gymnosperms appeared at the end of the Devonian or the beginning of the Carboniferous period about 319 million years ago. Today there are roughly 7 families and over 600 species of conifers. Although the total number of species is relatively small, conifers are ecologically important. They are the dominant plants over large areas of land, most notably the boreal forest of the northern hemisphere, but also in similar cool climates in the mountains further south. Let's look at some of Kentucky's native conifer trees. We have the bald cypress, eastern hemlock, eastern red cedar, eastern white pine, northern white cedar, pitch pine, shortleaf pine, and Virginia pine. We'll also discuss loblolly pine, which is, while not native to Kentucky, it's been widely planted. When we look at our Kentucky conifer trees, it's also important to look at some of the statistics about our conifers that have been collected by the United States Department of Agriculture and Forest Service. It's called the Forest Inventory Analysis. So we can get an idea of an approximation of the number of stems by species and in what counties that they've been present if they were sampled there. So when we look at our Kentucky conifer statistics by species, we'll notice that on our table here that eastern red cedar is the most dominant, has the most number of stems that were recorded in our forest inventory analysis. And the second most numerous is our Virginia pine. And then finally, our third most numerous is our eastern hemlock. And we'll discuss all of these species as we go on further in our presentation. While we've mentioned all of our different native conifers, it's important to mention some really great tips for helping us to identify these conifer trees out in the woods. And the first and probably the easiest place to start is with the leaves, or in this case, the needles. And some of the main characteristics we're going to look at when we're trying to identify what conifer tree we have in front of us is what does the needle look like? Are they scale-like needles, which we see right here? They look like little overlapping scales. Or are the needles in single form? There's just one needle attached to the twig at a time. Or will we see our needles in groups or bundles like we see here? So it'll be more of a needle-like, and they'll be grouped together with a little woody cup down here at the bottom. Here we have 2 in this grouping, and in this grouping we have 5. And they're grouped together in that little woody cup. We also call these bundles fascicles, but for this presentation we're going to refer to them as bundles. So being able to look at your leaves and determining, does this tree have scale-like leaves on it? Are the leaves, the needle-like leaves, are they single, not in bundles, or are they in bundles? And being able to count how many needles in a bundle can also be a really helpful identification characteristic. So here we have just some actual photographs of our needle-type trees. Our conifers that have needle-like leaves, and an example of that would be our eastern white pine, really common tree that we see in our landscape plantings as well as in various parts of our forest. And then here's the eastern red cedar. Now it's an example of a conifer that has overlapping scale-like needles, and this is the one we saw that was so numerous across the state. But let's look at some of our different trees here in the state. So when we look at the conifers here in the state, our 2 that have scale-like needles are our eastern red cedar, which is the one here on the top, and then our northern white cedar, which is down here on the bottom. And I will note, northern white cedar is not super common in the state. It's found in a couple of counties in the eastern part of the state and a few in the south central part. And then we've got our needles that are single. So this is, as you can see really well on the eastern hemlock, it's one needle attached to the stem. They're not in bundles. So these are our conifers that have single needles. That's our eastern hemlock. This is the dark green one here, or our bald cypress, which we see this very soft feathery green color. And a neat note about bald cypress, it is our only deciduous conifer. And then we have all of the rest of our conifers. They were going to have needles in bundles. So we have our eastern white pine. Its needles are in bundles of 5. And then we've got pitch pine and loblolly. And remember, loblolly's the one that's we're not in its natural range, but it's been widely planted here. And loblolly's down here. You can see the needles are much longer on loblolly than they are on our pitch pine. But those needles will be in 3. And I guess a real quick note to point out too is when you're looking at needles on a conifer tree, you want to make sure you look at several sets of needles, because sometimes a needle may fall off, which would give you a false count of how many are in that bundle. But for our pitch pine, in groups of 3, pitch pine definitely a forested tree, and then our loblolly pine also in groups of 3s. The main difference between pitch and loblolly is loblolly needles are much longer than the pitch pine at about their 3 or 4 inches. And then we've got shortleaf pine, another one of our important forest pine trees. Now its needles are going to be grouped in 2s and 3s. So there it's really important to check multiple sets of needles to make sure you're not hitting only just the 3s. Make sure it's not a shortleaf and when you're actually might be calling it a pitch pine. But shortleaf needles are in 2s and 3s. And then last we have our Virginia pine, and we also call this the scrub pine, and it tends to have much shorter needles, and those are in groups of 2, and you can actually see here's a real nice one right here in groups of 2, and they're usually a little bit twisted. So those are the breakdown of our conifers and how their needles are grouped. All right, it's test time. From that quick review of what we went over with needles, are they scale-like, are they a single needle, or are they grouped? Let's see how we do with a little practice test. So our first one, do we have needles or do we have scales? Hopefully everybody says needles. Great. Yep, this is a great example of a needle type tree. In fact, this is our eastern white pine. But you can see with the little cup, woody cup, that's holding all of those needles together. All right, are these needles single or are they in bundles? Let's look close, and hopefully everybody's seeing that these needles are single. And this example is our eastern hemlock, but you can see we have one needle attached to the twig. They're not in a group. Now, are these needles in bundles of 2 or 5? I've actually pulled it off here so you can see it much easier. So if we can see our little woody cup down here holding those needles together, we count each of our needles. We count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We see we have needles in groups or bundles of 5. All right, let's go to our next one. So let's look close. This one's a little bit harder. It's kind of, it's the whole stem. But if we want to see our needles in bundles of 2 or 3, well, it's kind of hard to count up here, but we can see we've got needles. But when we look down here at our needles, we can count 1, 2, 3. We look at this group over here, 1, 2, 3. We have needles in bundles of 3. And this is an example of our pitch pine. All right, so let's talk about some of the native conifers we find here in Kentucky. Our first is our eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana. Its common name is misleading because it's not a true cedar tree. It's really a juniper, hence its scientific name, Juniperus virginiana. It's a common conifer that grows on a variety of sites, but it's most common on poor dry soils derived from limestone substrate. It's the most common conifer found in Kentucky, and it's considered a pioneer or invader species of old fields and open forested sites. The leaves are evergreen and occur in 2 forms. On seedlings and new twigs, the leaves are pointed and needle-like, often light green. But on mature branches, they're those overlapping scales that are tight to the twig. Eastern red cedar is dioecious, meaning two houses, that there are male trees and female trees, but occasionally there are monoecious trees, or trees that will have male and female reproductive structures. The male reproductive structures are small, yellow-brown, occurring in large groups, and the females are light blue-green. Male trees tend to be taller and have greater diameter growth than female trees, which may contribute to their success as pollen donors. The flowers are wind pollinated, and pollination occurs from February to May, depending on location. The fruit is a small berry-like cone that contains 1 to 4 seeds. The cones or berries are light green in the spring and ripen to dark blue in fall. They mature from late July to mid-November, and these berry-like cones remain on the tree until the following spring. Eastern red cedar produces most seed between the ages of 25 and 75, though seed production can occur in trees as young as 10 years and as old as 100 plus years. The seeds are disseminated by birds and small mammals. Most eastern red cedar trees produce some seed nearly every year, but good seed crops occur usually every 2 to 3 years. The bark is reddish-brown in color, and it's thin and fibrous, and it tends to exfoliate in long strips or separates into long fringed scales. Virginia pine, Pinus virginiana, is a somewhat scrubby pine and one of the 4 pine species native to Kentucky. It's also known as scrub pine, Jersey pine, and spruce pine. The tree tends to retain branch stubs along the trunk, and this adds to that unkept, scrubby appearance. It's usually found at higher elevations of the Piedmont and mountain regions of the eastern United States. In Kentucky, it's abundant throughout the Knobs and the Cumberland Plateau, as well as the western coal fields. It is a pioneer species that can grow on very poor sites, but its best growth is in well-drained, sandy, acidic, loamy soils. The leaves of Virginia pine are short needles that are typically 1.5 to 3 inches long and often twisted, and they are in groups of 2. The needles are yellowish dark green and can remain on the tree 3 to 4 years. This species is monoecious, meaning one house, which means a tree has both male and female reproductive structures. The male pollen structures are cylindrical, yellow to orangish and near the tip of the branches, and the females are pale green and larger than the males and spread throughout the crown. The fruit is a smallish ovoid cone that's about 1.5 to 2.5 inches long. The cones are sessile on the branch, and sometimes they're in groups of 2. They have red-brown scales that are armed with a sharp needle-like prickle at the end. The cone ripens during the second autumn and contains 1/4 inch oval light brown winged seeds. The seeds are dispersed starting in the fall and may continue through the following spring. Virginia pine produces cones in all parts of the crown, and the trees begin cone production as early as 5 years, and trees tend to produce seed every year with good seed crops every 3 years, and the empty cones tend to persist on the tree for numerous years. The bark of Virginia pine is orange-brown and scaly on young trees, but as the tree gets older and the stems develop thin, small, scaly plates with cinnamon-colored patches on the upper parts of the trunk. Eastern hemlock, Tsuga canadensis, is a conifer of cooler climates. It's also called Canada hemlock and hemlock spruce. There are 4 Tsuga species in North America, 2 in the east and 2 in the west. Eastern hemlock is a slow-growing, long-lived tree. Eastern hemlock's native range includes the southern border of Canada to Nova Scotia into New England, the mid-Atlantic and the Lake States, and south into the Appalachian Mountains into northern Georgia, and west into Indiana and western Kentucky, and it's found mostly in eastern Kentucky. Eastern hemlock is evergreen. The leaf is a flat needle that is single on the stem. It's not in groups or bundles. The needles are mostly 2-ranked. The needles are typically 1/2 inch long and taper to a dull point. They are shiny dark green on top and have 2 white lines of white stomata on the underside, and the stomata are the minute pores in the surface of the leaf or the needle. The needles usually persist for about 3 years. Eastern hemlock is monoecious. The hemlock reproductive structures are in separate clusters on the same branch. The male reproductive structures, or conelets, are yellow, small, and rounded in the axis of the needles from last year's growth, and the female conelets are light green and form at the end of the branches. Eastern hemlock's fruit is an ovoid light brown cone. It's usually about 3/4 inches long with rounded entire scales. The cones change from yellowish green to purple brown as they mature. When they mature in the fall around mid-October, they are deep brown and the scales open to release the seed. Cones close in wet weather and open again when it's dry. This prolongs seed dispersal. Eastern hemlock has very small seed and they are dispersed by wind but usually fall within the tree's canopy range because the wings are so small on the seed. The bark of eastern hemlock is gray-brown on young trees and begins to become scaly as the tree grows and ages. In older trees, the bark is reddish-brown with wide ridges and furrows. When the surface of the bark is fresh cut, you can see purple streaks. Loblolly pine, Pinus tidata, also called Arkansas pine, North Carolina pine, and Oldfield pine, is one of the most commercially important forest species in the southern United States. The loblolly pine is a pine of the southeastern United States, but it has been widely planted throughout Kentucky. The leaf is an evergreen needle that's about 6 to 9 inches long, with usually 3 yellow-green needles per bundle. The difference between it and pitch pine is the length of the needle. Both of those are in groups of 3. The species is monoecious. The male reproductive structure are long and cylindrical, and they're red to yellow in clusters at the branch tips, and the females are yellow to purple. The fruit is an ovoid to cylindrical 3 to 6 inch red to brown cone, and the umbo, or the small rounded or blunt protuberance at the end of the pine cone scale, is armed with a short spine. The bark is initially red to gray, brown and scaly, and on older trees it's ridged and furrowed and somewhat rounded scaly plates. And on very old trees it has red, brown, flat scaly plates. Eastern white pine, Pinus strobus, is a valuable and versatile conifer. It's also called northern white pine. It's one of the largest of the northeastern conifers and commonly grows 80 to 100 feet tall with a diameter of 2 to 3.5 feet. It's used for timber, landscaping, Christmas trees, and reforestation purposes. Eastern white pine is native to the eastern United States and the eastern provinces of Canada. It's one of the conifers found in Kentucky. Its leaves are soft, flexible, 3 to 5 inch long needles that occur in bundles of 5. The needles are bluish-green in color, and they appear this color because there are several grayish-blue lines of stomata, which are the minute pores in the surface of the leaf. Typically, white pine will retain needles for 3 to 4 years, but in autumn 2 or 3-year-old needles will change color and drop, leaving only the current season's growth still attached. Eastern white pine is monoecious. The male reproductive structures are cylindrical in shape, yellow, and in clusters at the base of new branchlets. The females are light green with a slight red tint at the ends of the branches. The males are typically found lower in the tree crown, while the females are found in the upper portion of the canopy. The fruit is a cone that's between 4 to 7 inches long, and the cone is cylindrical in shape and often slightly curved. The cone has rounded scales that are very resinous. The cones are green when immature and turn yellow-green to light brown when they ripen in late summer. Most of the seeds are dispersed mostly by wind within a month or so of ripening. Gray squirrels and white-footed mice and voles also disperse the seed to a limited extent. The cones will typically remain on the tree throughout the winter until the next spring. The bark on young trees is thin, smooth, and gray-green with some lighter patches. As the tree ages and grows, the bark becomes thicker, 1 to 2 inch thick, with bark broken into roughly rectangular blocks that are somewhat scaly on the surface. Shortleaf pine, Pinus echinata, is one of the commercially important southern yellow pines. Depending upon locale, the species is also called shortleaf yellow, southern yellow, oldfield, short straw, or Arkansas soft pine. Shortleaf pine has the widest geographic range of any pine in the southeastern United States. It is found mostly in the eastern portion of Kentucky. The needles are in bundles of 2s and 3s. And the needles are typically 3 to 5 inches long, slender, and flexible, and they are dark green yellow, and the needles will typically persist 2 to 4 years. Shortleaf pine is monoecious, and the male structures are green to reddish purple before ripening to brown when the pollen is shed. The female structure is green to red to purple. The fruit is a cone, and the cone is egg-shaped and about 2 inches long and nearly sessile, and green when immature. They are red to brown in color and have a small prickle or spike, and the pine cones mature in the fall of the second growing season. Once the cone ripens and dries out in late October to early November, the bracts open and the wing seeds fall out, usually landing relatively close to the parent tree. The seeds overwinter on the ground, and those remaining germinate the following spring. However, many of the seeds are eaten by small mammals and birds. The bark is dark and rough and scaly on the trees, and as the tree ages, the bark changes color to a reddish brown and is broken into flat, scaly plates, and the plates have small surface pockets about the size of a pencil point, which are resin or pitch pockets. Pitch pine, Pinus rigida, is one of Kentucky's 4 native pines. Pitch pine is considered one of the most productive timber pines on poorer sites. The wood is very resinous, so it's resistant to decay, which made it important in the early days of wooden shipbuilding. And the seeds provide a good source of food for a variety of small mammals and birds during winter months. Pitch pine's range includes central Maine, south to northern Georgia, and there are outlying pitch pine populations as far west as western Kentucky. In Kentucky, it's mostly found in the eastern portion of the state, with pockets in western Kentucky. The needles are evergreen, about 2.5 to 5 inches long. There are usually 3 slightly twisted needles per bundle. Remember, this is the other one in groups of 3. This is a good characteristic to distinguish from shortleaf pine, which usually has needles in groups of 2s and 3s. The needles are stiff and typically yellow-green to green in color. Pitch pine is monoecious. The male reproductive structure is cylindrical in large clusters at the tips of the twigs, and they are usually red to yellow in color. And the female structures have small curved scales and also red to yellow in color, and the pollen is usually shed in early spring. The fruit is a sessile ovoid cone that is between 2 to 5 inches long. The pine cone scales are armed with a short prickle. They are light brown in color, and the seeds are 3-angled and up to 1/2 inch long with the brownish wings. Cones reach maturity at the end of the second year, and the cones may open then or remain on the tree for numerous years before opening. Seed dispersal varies. Some seeds are wind dispersed, others disperse the following opening due to fire and may not travel very far. Trees typically begin seed production around 8 to 12 years with good seed crops every 4 to 9 year intervals. The bark on young trees is dark and very scaly. As the tree ages, the bark thickens to 1 to 2 inches, and the bark becomes smoother with brownish yellow plates, and the plates are separated by narrow, irregular fissures. Bald cypress, Taxodium distichum, is one of the most distinctive southern conifers with its deciduous foliage, buttressed trunk, and its formation of cypress knees. It is the classic tree of the southern swamp. Because of its attractiveness, it's been widely used as an ornamental well beyond its natural range. Bald cypress is native to the southeastern United States and is naturally found only in southwestern Kentucky along the Mississippi, Ohio, and Green Rivers. Bald cypress is a deciduous conifer, meaning it's going to lose its leaves in the fall, grow new needles in the spring. The needles are flat, usually 1/4 to 3/4 inches long, and they're 2-ranked. The needles are soft and they emerge in early spring, and they are green to yellow-green, darkening during growing season. In the autumn, the needles turn russet or copper color before being shed. The tree is monoecious. The male reproductive structures are in drooping panicles about 3 to 5 inches long, and the females are almost globe-shaped with small extending scales occurring near the ends of the branches. The fruit is a 3 to 4 inch, 3/4 to 1 inch globe-shaped cone. The cones are composed of scales, and they look like a woody brown sphere with a rough surface. Each cone has 9 to 14 5-sided scales that typically have 2 irregular triangle-shaped seeds. They turn from green to brownish purple as they mature in October to December. Streams and moving water are the most important means of seed dispersal. The bark is somewhat variable, but typically thin and fibrous, red-brown or maybe gray when exposed to the weather. It has an interwoven pattern of narrow flat ridges and narrow furrows that peels off in long strips. On older trees, the the bark may appear somewhat scaly, and that fibrous bark provides a nice winter appeal when the tree is without its foliage. Northern white cedar, Thuya occidentalis, is also called eastern white cedar, but probably most commonly known as arborvitae. It's also called swamp cedar. The tree provides valuable shelter and browse in winter deer yards and is widely planted as an ornamental. Northern white cedar is a conifer that's found on moist soils in the Lake States, northern New England, and eastern Canada. It also occurs locally in the southern Appalachians on limestone outcrops and found scattered in several eastern and southeastern counties in Kentucky. The leaves are evergreen and scale-like, and on the main shoots they're about 1/4 inch long, and it's that nice overlapping scale like we see with our eastern red cedar. The species is monoecious. The female structures are green with 4 to 6 scales, and the male structures are green tipped with brown and kind of globose in shape. The fruit is a cone that's about 1/2 inch long and oblong in shape. It's borne upright on the branches, and the scales are leathery red-brown and rounded, with a small spine on the tip. The bark is fibrous, and it's kind of red-brown in color, and it weathers to gray. And there's a diamond-shaped pattern that's usually apparent in the bark. I wanted to also share a few online tree resources that you can find out additional information about some of the conifers that we discussed in the presentation, or even other trees that you might be interested in. For identification purposes, iNaturalist can be a really handy, helpful tool it's a free app you download on your phone. You take a picture of whatever you're trying to identify, and it's going to give you a few options that you will see which one most closely matches what you have, and you can learn more about that organism. Then if you're solely focusing on trees, Virginia Tech Tree Identification. This is also an app for your phone. It's very robust, a lot of species, but they also have an online presence as well if you'd like to take your sample inside with you to help identify it or learn more about whatever the tree is. And then there's the Arbor Day Tree Identification. This, of course, is an online resource, so you need to bring your sample inside as you go through a dichotomous type key to figure out what type of tree you have, and then learn more about it. We also have at our UK Forestry Natural Resources website our tree identification videos that go through a lot of the characteristics to help you identify trees, which then can lead you to learn more about that individual. And then I also wanted to mention the UK Forestry Natural Resources Common Trees of Kentucky videos. The trees that we just covered in this past presentation, most all of those, there is a short video for each individual tree that will go into much greater detail about the natural history of the tree, sites where that tree is found, wildlife uses, and products that we use that or can get from that tree. So check those out. And then last, the UK Horticulture Native Trees of Kentucky fact sheets. There's about 75 to 80 different fact sheets, one-pagers that will tell you about some of the native trees in Kentucky. And then also can't not talk about a few of our other book forms if we want to take a book out, not just use our phone. A really good one that we talk about quite a bit is the Tree Finder. This is a great little dichotomous key for eastern half of the United States. Inexpensive, $5-6. You can get it on Amazon, pocket size. It's got about 70 different species in there, and it's a step-by-step to help you identify the native tree that you are trying to identify. If you are wanting to use this for conifers, like we have just identified in the past presentation, you want to make sure you get the green one or the summer version. The conifers are not in the winter tree finder. They have both a winter and a summer finder with leaves and without leaves. Another one that I really like is Trees and Shrubs of Kentucky. It's a great book, hardback book that will show you the trees that are native to Kentucky all through the seasons. Really good resource. And then, of course, Sibley's Guide to Trees, wonderful resource. And then one I always like to mention is the Natural History of Trees. It's got some great natural history, myths, folklore about many of our trees in the eastern United States. So I hope you enjoyed learning about some of the native conifers in Kentucky today, and enjoy going out and looking at our trees this fall.